Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. I'm David Bell for the Trinity at Waiaki Learning Centre. Tonight we're going to look at one of the very important parables that Jesus told. It's from Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 20, and we'll be having some detailed explanation of a few verses and trying to gain an overall impression of what this parable is all about. Now, before we begin, let me just bring up the screen share so we can see what our questions are for today. There we are. Should be up on screen now. And what we see here is that this is part of a new series from Kiwi Connection. It's called Tall Tales and True from the Far Country. And what that means is that we've got a whole variety of sermons and similar sorts of talks in church context that we're going to be updating and presenting in new and hopefully lively ways that engage people with the gospel material all over again. So what I hope to do tonight is to talk about this particular tall tale that Jesus told from the far country. And if you want to know where the far country is, well, you'll have to basically look at some of the videos, the introductory guide to the far country that we posted into YouTube just a little while ago. See, our first viewers are coming in now. And because it's just me that will be broadcasting this evening, if you've got any questions and answers as I go through, I'd be very, very happy indeed to answer those. So I'll just bring down the screen share for the time being. And there we go. So our basic tale tonight is a parable that Jesus told, and I'm going to try and summarize it for you. The tale of the laborers in the vineyard goes something like this, and I'm going to concentrate on the first sentence in a little bit. But the essence of the tale, the parable, is that a landowner, so it must have been quite a person of considerable wealth, decided that he needed to hire workers to work in the vineyard, whether it was harvest time or whether there was work to be done on the vines, we simply don't know. But he heads along to the marketplace and he begins the process of hiring workers for the vineyard quite early in the morning. I think it says 9 o'clock he makes his first trip down there, and he hires some workers to do whatever is required. He makes another trip down at midday, and he makes a further trip down at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the net effect of this is that under Jewish law at the time, he's required to pay them their wages at the end of the day. So he calls his steward in, and he tells the steward to distribute the wages amongst the workmen, and he gives a kind of a policy to the steward. He sort of says everyone is to be paid identically. Now, in terms of being able to understand what this parable is on about, we have to imagine it like a stage and actors on the stage, because it's I'm just being told that the sound quality is poor here, so just let me see if I can adjust that straight away. And let's see whether that's made any significant difference. So there's both Max and Stuart have fed in that the sound quality is poor. So just tell me if that is any better, and I'll be very happy indeed to then make further adjustments if I can. So let's just recap. You've got the owner of the vineyard. He's gone to the marketplace 3 times. The workers have worked at different stages of the day for different hours. Thank you, Max. That's great. We'll keep going with this microphone. So what happens is he sets the stage so that the workers that were hired last actually pick up their pay first. Now, the parable wouldn't work. It wouldn't have any tension in it whatsoever if it did the opposite. If you had the ones that were hired first got paid first, because they'd take their money and go home, they wouldn't witness what was about to happen. So how whoever has written this into the Bible, however they've done it, they've got the stage set in a particular way. So it so happens that as each person is paid, the owner is instructing the steward or the manager to pay each one exactly the same wage. And there's going to be some grumblings about that, and also there's going to be some significant silences, and we're going to explore what those grumblings and silences mean as we go through the explanation. But having said that, let's immediately go back and have a look at the screen share, because we need to just establish. Here we go. Just one moment. We need to establish now exactly what is going on in the first sentence of the parable. And what I'd like to do is highlight for you a reading that it's a New Revised Standard Version, but it's actually what's called Jewish annotated scripture or Bible. And that means that Jewish scholars have gone through and they've made comments on verse by verse and so on. Anyway, here's the first verse of the parable. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard." So that's the opening sentence of this parable. And the closing sentence apparently is, "So the last will be first and the first will be last." So we've set some parameters on where the parable starts and where it finishes according to the biblical text. But if you cast your eyes just a little bit above that, you find that that verse, "the first will be last and the last will be first," is actually repeated immediately before this parable begins. In fact, it's repeated a number of times in Matthew's Gospels. First, last, last, first. It's quite a well-known saying. So whoever has collected these stories of Jesus and put them together has kind of bracketed it in this idea of the last first, the first last. And that may not necessarily be the way that Jesus wants us to read the parable. It may be, it may not be. All we can do is raise the question of whether this is in any way correct. So, without any further ado, let's have a look at 4 themes that emerge in that first verse. The Bible is conveying a message, and let's think about the communications triangle here. The communications triangle, any kind of communication, we've said this on previous occasions, involves 3 people. It's someone who sends the message. There's someone who hears the message, the receivers, but there's also the mode of communication. So in the communication triangle that I've listed, we, the hearers, are really way down the bottom of that blue triangle. You've got Jesus separated at some distance of 2,000 years with his communication, and what's conveying the message to us is the Bible itself. And I've sort of tried to make that like a 3-dimensional triangle. So what's going on is that the Bible, as it travels through those 2,000 years, is building up layers of meaning and complexity and overlays and underlays, overtones and undertones, to the particular message that Jesus wants to get across. So the Bible itself is now conveying a message that's perhaps different in kind, different in part, or maybe it's identical to the message that Jesus first talked about. I suspect that it consists of a lot of complex undertones and overtones. And the first thing that comes to mind is, in this opening verse of the parable, the kingdom of heaven's like this: a landowner went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now, part of the semiotic sign structure within the New Testament would say that that word vineyard is very, very significant in the life of Israel. The vineyard was in some ways a sign that betokened Israel itself. So when the first people heard Jesus tell this, if Jesus in fact said the kingdom of heaven is like, and he likens it to the vineyard, they would take that as a signal that the nation or the state or the kingdom, if you like, that's the best word, the Malkuth, the kingdom of Israel, is somehow going to be talked about in this parable. So the vineyard is a very important sign within the parable. What else occurs in that parable opening sentence? Well, the word labor. The owner went out to hire laborers. Now, that implies that these people have the dignity of work. Now, within the structure of Israelite society in the time of Jesus, got to remember that there's been 1,000 years plus of the movement from being slaves in Egypt to being free people. They were poor people. 99% of the population was very, very poor, but they were essentially free, though there were some slaves, without a doubt. Now, the important thing is that the labor here is worthy of the hire. We've got a principle in biblical analysis that talks about intertextuality, and that means one text can inform another. Doesn't mean that they always inform. Sometimes they're in sharp conflict. But what's going on in this first verse is the concept of labor is very important, and you know that because within the 10 commandments, you actually have a commandment that is all about honoring God on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is a day of rest, a day where one doesn't labor. So that's an important symbol within that first sentence. There's another one. Jesus apparently says, for the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven. Now, it's a significant fact that only Matthew of all the evangelists uses that phrase, kingdom of heaven. If you look in Mark and Luke, you'll find that it's the kingdom of God that's talked about rather than the kingdom of heaven. And I use the Jewish word Malkuth, which is about that concept of a kingdom, not a kingdom that is a physical place, but rather the qualities that might be associated within the best kind of kingdom. So the Bible, in that one verse, is conveying a message, the kingdom of heaven, not a physical place, not something that we're aspiring to actually travel to, but rather something that our hearts expect and are inspired by when we're talking about God. And finally, I've put in the idea of justice. Now, justice is not actually talked about in the first verse, but it's a theme that emerges as the parable unfolds. So you've got vineyard, labor, heaven, and justice, and the Bible in one verse is conveying to the hearers of Jesus a number of very significant themes indeed. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen at that point and ask the folk that are watching, we've had up to 4 concurrent viewers in, do you have any questions or queries about what I've said so far. And just in summary, this parable is encapsulated before the parable begins. The first shall be last and the last shall be first, and that's repeated verse 16 of chapter 20. So it's sort of encapsulated, it's bounded by those 2 points. Then the parable begins with these big themes. Now, I think they're really important themes, and they're tremendous in how Jesus actually develops this parable and starts to give us all kinds of insights into it. So no one's fed through any questions yet, so I'll go back to sharing my screen. There we go. Present to everyone. So there are the big themes. The first 3, vineyard, labour, heaven, in that first verse, and justice emerges as part of the theme of the parable, the overall parable itself. So moving on to the next screen share. In that 3-dimensional triangle, the big red block was meant to illustrate the Bible moving through 2,000 years of being told, retold, translated. Oh, goodness knows, it's gone through so many different variations. But often it's in the art associated with the Bible that we start to see how different people have interpreted. So this is a painting, I think, from the 18th century that was relatively recently discovered. And it's got, in the artist's imagination, the labourers in the vineyard, in the marketplace, are a pretty wild lot. They appear to be wenching, they appear to be drinking, they appear to be gambling. This is quite an interesting picture in its own right. And if we moved on, we've got the idea from Vincent van Gogh, a beautiful, serene kind of scene here. Okay, it's not biblical Israel at all, but nevertheless, what he's trying to convey in this is that there's a dignity about labour, very different, isn't it, from the previous image. So there we are. As the Bible moves, it traverses through time, different people pick up different ideas and relate to it in different ways. So now I think we've got everything in place to be able to understand what's going on with the actors, the props, and the themes in this tall tale from the far country. The essence of the story, let's look at the pay. What he's going to pay them is, and I quote from the NSRV, call the labourers, give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first, and they each received the usual daily wage. Now, the usual daily wage could have been a denarius, something like that. The pay itself, the actual pay, is not important. The fact is that everything in this parable revolves around the pay being equal for every worker. So that's my first comment about the parable. The pay is fixed for all, no matter how long they laboured, no matter how long they worked. Then you've got that curious idea of the first and the last shall be first. It's almost as if whoever has put together this gospel that's called Matthew has possibly, because the parable, perhaps Jesus did say about the first coming and getting as much as those that had laboured all day, perhaps he's somehow conflated with the first and last of the other moral applications where this verse is applied into various contexts. So you've got fixed pay, the first come and get paid as much as the last. And let's cast ourselves now into the role of the labourers. How would you feel if you were one of those who was hired at 3 o'clock and got a full day's pay. How would you feel? I think you would feel pretty darn good. But the real artistry of the parable is that no emotional or logical response comes from any of the laborers. Those who have been what we might consider to be overpaid aren't saying how deliriously happy they are. Whilst those who are watching these latecomers being given their denarius are probably expecting that they're going to be paid double. So this sort of a tension that's going on, if we cast ourselves in the role of the labourer, each time, or rather at the time we were hired, will make a significant difference to our reaction. But no reactions are recorded from those that were hired at 3 o'clock or 12 o'clock. The ones that came at 12 o'clock, they are also given a denarius. The ones that were hired early in the morning are given a denarius. It's those ones who have been forced to suffer the indignity of their labour being equated to those who worked far less. So there's an indignity here that's very embarrassing, being forced to watch someone else get something that is unmerited, undeserved, an act of grace. So there we are. That's casting ourselves in the role of the labourer. How about if we cast ourselves in the role of the steward? What's the steward doing in this particular instance? Well, the steward does what his master says. The steward, like the labourers, or the first two groups of labourers, says nothing. He simply carries out orders. And maybe he's secretly delighted that everyone's getting paid the same. Maybe he's enraged by it. We don't know. But there's an interesting side tale, I'd say, here, and it's the story of the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann. When Eichmann was brought to trial, well after the close of World War II, I think he had escaped to South America, and he was eventually picked up and brought back to stand trial. He was the man who had organized the train system. And it was a vast enterprise he organized that delivered hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children to the concentration camps. And during the course of the trial, an American philosopher, a woman who had in fact escaped from Nazi, just fled Germany before the Nazis finally took over, she was at the trial of Eichmann, and she was fascinated by Eichmann's response. He said all the way through, he was only obeying orders. He didn't order the final solution, but in his own mind, apparently, according to this particular philosopher, Eichmann did not believe that he had any moral culpability, because he believed he was actually doing the right thing by obeying orders. So I just mentioned that as an interesting side issue. The steward doesn't, or the manager doesn't, say yay or nay to either the grumblers or those that got paid so much extra. It's almost as if there is a tension in that role. And all of us who've been involved in church life in every aspect of it, whether it's as a lay person or whether it's as a minister or a deacon or however it works, to some extent we've all been caught up in obeying orders. And the idea that we should obey orders and just do our role, I think, is quite abhorrent to the values of the kingdom of God. But that's a side issue. It's certainly not a main issue in the parable. the tensions are there between the different groups of laborers, the steward, and then we come to the landowner. And you've got to be a wealthy person in Jesus' parables to own land. Land and vineyards are signs of prosperity. And this is very, very interesting, because most of the biblical commentators reserve the role of the landowner for God alone. And reserving that role of the landowner as God alone means that we can't, while we can play the role of the laborers and we can play the role of the steward, we can't play the role of the landowner. And I take issue with the vast majority of the biblical commentators at this point who say that that role is reserved for God. What would it be like if the landowner was in fact to be identified as God? Well, God is giving mercifully, God is giving generously, God is behaving graciously. No matter what stage of the day you showed up, you all get exactly the same reward. This is possibly a talk of the coming eschaton, the big change. The kingdom was at hand. The old age is drawing to a close. The new age is coming in. And the landowner, if he is God, is to be identified as bringing in this new age. Now, Max has asked the question, can we assume that the laborers hired late in the day would have liked to have been hired earlier? Well, if I was one, yeah, I certainly would agree, Max, that if you were hired late, oh, no, sorry, I've misread your question. If you were hired late in the day, would you have liked to have been hired earlier? No, I think I would much rather have been hired late and paid more rather than being hired earlier and paid less. But maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't think we can assume anything. What the parable does is set up these indescribable internal tensions and contradictions. And that's why I believe that the parable itself invites us to behave as if we were the landowner. The landowner role is not reserved for God alone. Now, that may seem a very strange thing to say, but here's the reality as far as I'm concerned. When you use that principle of intertextuality, you find time and time again that many of the other parables draw you in and ask you, where do you fit? What role are you playing in this parable? And if we play the role of the landowner, it gives us a whole new way of working, which, if you like, is based entirely on the same principle of generosity of grace that we believe that God has. I think it's inconceivable that we're not asked to do this. If we can't behave as God would have us behave in the kingdom, then I don't think we can ever enter it. So that brings us now to the question of what about the kingdom and what about God in all of this? If you go back to the last will be first and the first will be last, that section is all about the eschaton, when the Son of Man is seated on his throne in glory, and Peter is asked, who then shall be saved? And this is as far as Jesus is concerned, look, with God, everything is possible. And I think then the parable is placed into that context and asks us, well, if it's all possible with God, is it also possible with us? Because the kingdom is at hand. We are the forerunners, the taste of the glory divine. So there's my key understanding about this parable. It's different from how you expect. It knocks the world for six because we all want God to behave in the way that the parable suggests. Once we get past the initial jealousies of, you know, the overpayments and the underpayments, once we're past that, we all think that God should behave that way. Because if God doesn't behave that way, then we're not saved. We can't be. But if God does act that way, then why shouldn't people in the kingdom act with similar generosity of grace? And that is my key point for tonight's parable. So I've had only the one question, and I hope that that's been of some use, some enlightenment. We've had quite a few visitors coming and going, 4 to 6, been with us. And the last thing I'd like to say, because we're pretty well at the end of our time, just 5 minutes to go. I said it would only be a 30-minute broadcast tonight because I'm by myself. The last thing I'd like to say is about the way in which the new version of Kiwi Connection is operating. All our badging system is now complete. As you know, the AA, the Advancement for Evidence-Based Learning, 120 plus universities had a little interesting look at our badging system and used it in a very recent conference. That's now all operative. We've got a new, when you click into your login page, the Kingdom of God will open up. There's, instead of before you log in, there's a new button that you can, or new link that you can click. It says, learn how to use your e-portfolio. Even our live on air and all its curated content now, you can get it a single click without having to log in at the login page. So there's been a tremendous development there, and I'm very, very grateful to everyone that supports us, particularly the Trinity at Waiaki Learning Centre and numerous friends who subscribe on YouTube. I'll put it out in the newsletter coming out in the next day or so. We've had over 10,000 Facebook likes and shares, over or at least one is reporting we're up to 600,000 watched minutes now. So there's a tremendous amount happening. I'm very grateful. I hope these broadcasts are of considerable use to you, and I'll say thank you very much. Over and out for tonight, and I'll look forward to next week. We've got Stuart McAdam and another guest coming in. We'll be talking more about this whole aspect of making movies and so on. Thank you very much. See you next time.